Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to ETTelecom Webinar. To present this webinar, we have with us Mr. Abhishek V, who is a partner consulting at Deloitte on the topic Tower Industry, Future is Data and Impact of Current Trends like Telco Consolidation. There will be a presentation on the topic followed by a question answer session wherein you can submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Abhishek. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Akansha. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I am audible. Thanks for your time today, and thanks for the opportunity provided to me. To briefly introduce myself, I am Abhishek. I am a partner in Deloitte Consulting. Have worked in telecom consulting all throughout my life and my career. Towers has been a key focus area for me, and have focused extensively on this space. And I've worked with tower players not only in India, but globally as well: Africa, Middle East, US, Europe, and also have worked across the value chain: telco players, tower players, PE funds, etc. in this space. So with this, I would begin my presentation, and I look forward to questions at the end of my presentation. So all of us are talking about data, how will it grow, what impact will it have on the various aspects of the ecosystem. Tower is a key component of it, and has played an instrumental role in growth of telecom sector in India. So the way I have structured my presentation is that first we will talk about a brief overview into telecom market in India. Then we will go into tower market in India. And finally, we will look at some of the future growth opportunities and challenges which data growth presents in the Indian context. The first slide which I am presenting is, and maybe all of you know, that India is at an inflection point of hyper data growth. We at Deloitte studied some 30+ countries, whether emerging, emerged, and what we found was a unique trend that as soon as smartphone penetration reaches 25 to 30%, you see an inflection point in how data is being consumed, and data kicks off on a S-curve of growth. And that's what we are seeing in India at this point of time. So India is at cusp of data growth, and what we are seeing right now is just the tip of the iceberg. What we will see in 2 or 3 years to come is that the data requirement or the data consumption per month will increase from the current levels of approximately 350 to 400 petabytes to something close to 1100 petabytes. So almost a 2.5 or a 3-fold growth from now on. And this will mean increased the burden on networks to deliver this data growth going forward. And this is the key point we need to keep into account, that whatever we have seen is just the beginning of a larger trend which is happening globally, and India is going to see as well. Moving ahead, I think the point that we want to highlight is that data is becoming more and more. Globally, if you look at markets which are similar to India or which are analogous to India, say Indonesia, what we are seeing is that voice is degrowing, data is rising. China is experiencing a similar trend. Other emerging markets are experiencing a similar trend. In India, we expect the same trend to continue, though over the last year we have seen sluggish revenue growth, and which is a trend globally as well. If I can say so, this is a challenging period for all telcos, and we are seeing a transition which is happening currently in terms of our ecosystem moving away from a voice-driven ecosystem to a data-driven ecosystem. And by 2020, it will be much more pronounced, and we will have 60% data and 40% revenue coming from voice. And data revenue will grow at a CAGR of 27%, and voice revenue will see fall, though at a relatively lower pace as we go along. As one of the very respected CEOs of a global telco said that all my data, all my traffic is data now. There is no voice in my traffic. What he meant was that even voice in the form of VoIP, VoLTE is coming to play in his network at this point of time. So the key trend that we see out here is that data growth will accelerate, and we will see a, a global trend or an emerging market trend of the overall revenue growth. This is another key aspect of it, that smartphone is what is driving the data consumption in India right now. Say in 2015, only 35% of data was consumed through smartphones, whereas currently almost 57% of data has been consumed through smartphones. And those smartphones are still a half of what we see feature phones exist. They are consuming more than double or almost double the data of what feature phones are consuming. Dongles remain a key area, and fixed wireless is another key area which is growing. I think Wi-Fi offloading, as I will talk going ahead in the presentation, we will see more and more impact of Wi-Fi offloading on the network. So on these three slides, basically the points that I have covered is, number one, India is at cusp of data growth. We will see more and more data consumption happening. Two, data revenues will rise. However, they will not compensate that much for the voice revenue growth, what we had seen during the peak periods of voice revenue growth, which we saw in 2008 to 2010 sort of period when the Indian telecom market was rising. Third, smartphones are the key drivers of data growth in India, and they end up consuming almost 60% of data consumption which is happening in India. So smartphone is the device which is driving data consumption in India. Moving ahead. So the next question we answer is that which technology will dominate? There have been various theories around what will happen to 2G, how will 3G pan out, how do we see 4G going forward? Obviously 4G is limited by the device type that we have. Who will become more dominant going forward? So what we did was, and what we found was that traditional mechanisms of projecting various technologies have not found to give the desired results. So we looked at various scenarios. We looked at a conservative data growth scenarios, we looked at a moderate data growth scenario, and we looked at a high data growth scenario. What we see particularly in moderate and high data growth scenario is, what we see in moderate and high data growth scenario is that 4G will be the dominant form, and 4G will primarily eclipse in a moderate and a high data growth scenario 3G over a period of time. So 3G will continue to still have subs, but what we will see and what we are already seeing in the marketplace is increasing investment in 4G networks. The user experience provided by 4G is higher. 4G phones ecosystem is rising in India with the push given by various operators. And what we will see is 4G becoming more and more dominant as we go along. However, 2G will not get removed because a large proportion of Indian population still cannot afford the 4G phone at the prices we are talking about, and they will still continue to have basic feature phones, particularly in rural, dense rural, and some of the semi-urban areas, and we will see some proportion of 2G going forward as well. So 4G becomes dominant, but 2G also remains, though its pie will reduce, but it continues to play a role in the networks to follow. So this is what I would like to highlight in this slide, that 4G will be the dominant technology going forward. Then what we looked at is that there is a lot of data being consumed, which is being consumed by users. How will this data be served? I think, and this is a key slide and one of my interesting slides, which I would like to discuss, is that earlier during the voice growth phase, and this is a big difference from voice growth to a data growth scenario that we are looking at. When voice grew and voice traffic grew, what we saw was more and more consumption and more reliance on macro networks, which is your traditional GBT, RTT, ground-based towers, rooftop towers, which we can see in that particular context. Now, what we are seeing is that because of high spectrum costs, relatively higher spectrum cost, physical limitations of deploying network, 67% of data being consumed indoors, and the need for having much more proficient networks, to deliver that, and content being available in various forms, whether in form of OTT, whether in form of other dimensions which is available, the data traffic is rising. And most of this demand and what we are seeing in US, Western Europe, etc., and even in emerging markets like Malaysia, Indonesia, that some of this demand and this traffic growth is being captured by Wi-Fi offloading and other mechanisms, which can include indoor building solutions or your small cell solutions which are emerging, or outdoor DAS solutions which are emerging. Though Wi-Fi will be the key driver and will account for a majority of this, almost 75 to 80% of this offloading will happen through Wi-Fi networks. So my macro site will become an aggregator in, say, in a dense urban area where this traffic is offloaded to some alternate mechanism, which is Wi-Fi, which is small cells, etc. And this will have this is a key dimension. Though the data traffic will grow at a significant pace, not all of it will come to our macro side infrastructure. And this is a key dimension from a tower business model perspective, that tower organizations, though, will need to continue to focus on macro infrastructure, but can look at alternate models. Given the current IP1 restrictions, we need to see how those evolve and how these can be tailored by the tower companies going forward. So that would remain a key element there. So the key point out here is that though the macro traffic will grow in absolute sense, some of this traffic will be offloaded to Wi-Fi and other mechanisms going forward. Now what we discussed was we gave a brief overview of what is happening in telecom market in India. And now coming back to the exact topic which was given to me around key drivers impacting the tower market in India, what we can look at into two category of factors, and I would like to spend some time on this slide. There are certain positive factors which are helping us drive data growth and as such drive tower tenancy growth, macro tenancy growth, or addendums for 3G, 4G, etc. over the main tenancy growth. The first is obviously launch of Jio. Jio has accelerated the S-curve potential which we were seeing in data growth, and it has given an impetus to data growth in India. Second, the point again around exponential data growth. What we are seeing is, as I pointed out in my first graph, we are at the cusp of data explosion, and we will see more and more data being consumed as proliferation of smartphone devices rises, and we see more and more content becoming available. There are new technologies which are emerging, which though will take another, particularly 5G will take another 2 to 3 years, but M2M and IoT are here, and we are seeing more and more push towards these areas as well. And particularly IoT, what we are seeing is more and more IoT devices coming into play as well. And then there are new growth opportunities. Everyone talks about digital India, smart cities, again giving push to digital consumption in India, how digital consumption can be driven, and how this will help again give push to the overall bandwidth requirements, data requirements going forward. And finally, I think the cache is the king of all. Every network, telco, as we know, is a capex intensive industry. You require technology refreshes, which are becoming more and more prominent as we go along. Earlier, 2G to 3G cycle was 10 years. It has reduced now from 3G to 4G, and 4G to 5G would be even faster in that sense. So telco consolidation will be positive in the long term, where we will see larger telcos ability to invest higher in capex and higher in network rollouts to provide better user experience and to reach out to a larger number of customers. I believe the enhanced capex will help in improving user experience, which will be very key in going forward. So this will play a critical role as we go along. On the flip side of things, what we might see in the short term is that telco consolidation, obviously what we are seeing is on a single tower, there might be two telcos which might be present. So if the two telcos have merged, what we will see is some of those rationalization which might be happening. Obviously, this will be only a short-term impact, maybe over the next 2 to 3 years, and will also depend upon what sort of contracts exist, how do tower companies and operators talk to each other, how these capacities can be utilized, and how we can go ahead. The second point is around, which I spoke about, mobile data offloading will happen. Not all traffic will flow to traditional macro architecture, but we will look for a HETnet-based architecture and various solutions based upon it. Third point is key. What we have seen is spectrum increase and enhancement in India. In India, over the last 2 to 3 years, and also because of telco consolidation, spectrum per operator has increased by almost 50 to 60%. And that's has resulted in increased efficiency, increased availability of spectrum for rolling out next generation of services. Though as data rises, more of this will be needed, and you will need either higher tower sites or higher spectrum to enable growth and cater to deliver the required user experience for your users. Finally, I believe we are looking at new generation technologies coming in. Carrier aggregation is already being deployed. Players like both Airtel and Reliance Jio have started using it. There are other areas which exist like SD and NFV, which are still 1 or 2 years down the line, but we are looking at emergence of those areas as well. So in net, what we see is what we are entering into an interesting time where there are a lot of factors which are interplaying with each other. Obviously, it's not correct to look at these factors in isolation, and all of these factors have a role to play as we go along in this as we look into evaluate how the tower industry will go forward in this particular context. And all these will have a bearing on the outcome of how we look at the growth of this industry going forward. This is just to highlight the spectrum point, and what we are highlighting out here is that India's spectrum per operator has increased from almost 20 to 38 megahertz per operator, primarily on the back of auctions which happened in 2015 and 2016, and also then the post consolidation which has been going on in the Indian market over last 1 year. Obviously, this spectrum holding will help in increasing the efficiency of rollout, and also efficiency of rollout, as well as help in increasing the overall user experience being delivered. However, there will be increased capacity available for operators, and obviously this will have an impact that as data growth rises, some of it can be fulfilled by the increased spectrum requirement. So this is a key point that we need to take into account as we look at how tower tenancies will grow going forward. This herein we are looking at, say, how is data growth impacting the tower business model. So earlier, if you look at it, the left-hand side of the graph, we had a voice-driven model. Voice-driven model was very helpful. It helped in the growth of tower industry in India. The tower industry, which was a unique, which was started in India as a very effective way of rolling out networks, helped drive penetration, voice growth, and revenue growth in the Indian context, which was very important. Now what we are seeing is emergence of data, and data brings it with different complexities. We are talking about increased fiberization of towers to cater to the growth demand, fully IP networks, emergence of head-net architectures where Wi-Fi and small cells coexist, emergence of new regulations like spectrum sharing, impact of carrier aggregation, etc. So basically, what we can classify them is into 3 areas. I think data will have a positive impact and in a significant way on the tower industry. What we will see is that macro sites will continue to grow, not only in dense urban and urban areas, but in other areas as well as we go along. And this will be a positive impact on this. Data brings with it some opportunities and some challenges, like small cell, fiber backhaul. A logical extension for a tower company can be a fiber core, which it can look to roll out. However, there are certain areas where tower companies will have to look at how do they get further integrated with the operator, how do they focus on that, and how do they roll out. So impact of technologies like carrier aggregation will have to be evaluated as we go along. So what we did as part of this was, and this is a proprietary Deloitte framework where we looked at that what will be the impact on tower tenancies. And here when we are talking about, as some of you who will be from tower industry will be familiar, tenancies are pure macro tenancies which are coming on a tower. Addendums are, say, operator already had a 3G site or a 2G site and deployed 4G E-Node B on that particular site. So those are addendums. What we are trying to estimate out here is a bottom-up mechanism of estimating what sort of tower and tenancy requirements will happen in India over the next 4 to 5 years. So how we went about this was that we looked at what will be the telecom penetration, and we did it at a circle-wise view. What will be the technology split across 2G, 3G, 4G? How will traffic or usage rise? What will be the impact of Wi-Fi offloading? Then what will be the impact of telco consolidation? How will VoLTE coming into India will impact? And then we estimated sites based upon basically three factors. One is coverage, and then capacity, both voice and data. Also coverage we classified as per dense urban, semi-urban, rural. And then capacity design was basically done on traffic and peak hour factors. So based upon this, we tried to estimate the tenancy requirements going forward. And we thought that it's difficult to predict what sort of scenarios exist. There are still unknown variables. So what we did was we classified them into three scenarios: conservative scenario, base scenario, and optimistic scenario. Conservative scenario was how many operators remain in India. So we assumed that in a conservative and base scenario, there will be 5 main operators, whereas in an optimistic scenario, there could be 6 operators. In data consumption, we took certain assumptions based upon what we were seeing in various geographies, how that trend can be extrapolated, and what does that particular output give us. And finally, we looked at spectrum availability and how will the spectrum availability enhance over this point of time. So basically, we looked at demand side factors. We looked at how demand side will evolve, how many operators will remain. Then we looked at data consumption, that how traffic will rise. And finally, we looked at how will spectrum evolve over this period of time. Based upon this, what we look at is that in India, the network expansion, 4G, and the resultant data growth will have a positive impact on how major tenancies will be required to grow. Obviously, there will be other factors which we discussed upon, that there will be Wi-Fi offloading, there is increased spectrum in the market, and operators are looking at a head-net-based architecture going forward. So what we primarily looked at was a mix of, under the three scenarios, what we are looking at is in an aggressive scenario, we might see between 2018 to 2023 a CAGR of 5.7% as far as tenancy growth is concerned. In a base scenario, 4.6%, and in a pessimistic scenario, 3.4%. If we don't see too much of data growth, but however, the additional spectrum is released and is available, and also we see increased consolidation on the market. I think it's fair to say that base and optimistic are more likely to happen in the Indian context, and that's what we would see going forward. We remain very optimistic about the Indian tower industry, and we see higher growth rates going forward, particularly for the tenancy predictions going forward. So data in net will have a positive impact, and I think operator consolidation in the long term will also have a positive impact, given higher ability of operators to launch their networks and expand their networks going forward. Now, I think the key point is that tower ecosystem is a fairly complex ecosystem, and it encompasses in itself various dimensions which a tower player can look at. Obviously, if you look at this particular diagram, what we are talking about is along the tower, you have a field force which is serving those towers. So you will have the potential to optimize that field force which exists. There is a Wi-Fi infrastructure which tower companies can help to deploy. Fiber is a big play, either fiber to the towers or fiber to the homes, which can be looked at. Obviously, these needs to be looked in the context of current regulatory framework and IP1 and the provisions within IP1. So this is more of a conceptual framework at this point of time, what I'm presenting you here, and this needs to be qualified based upon the regulatory requirements that we look at. So what we did was we looked at a simple matrix, which is simple matrix which focuses around what are the product and business models. So there is an existing model for tower operators, which is either macro site or addendums as they come along. Or these days, tower operators have started looking at micro sites, started experimenting with other solutions which exist as well in the marketplace. Then there are some adjacent opportunities which will exist. And then finally, you can either go into new consumer markets, or you can actually transcend yourselves and maybe play a leading role in some of the digital in India initiatives like smart cities, etc. So this is just a high level landscape of opportunities which data presents for tower companies and what they can look at going forward. Two of which we would like to touch upon are one is FiberCo and backhaul, and second is around digital India smart city play. I think fiberization in India will be key as we move more and more towards 4G. The bandwidth requirement at sites will increase, and as we move towards more and more full IP networks, and as we move towards 5G, more and more tower sites will be fiberized. I believe operators in India have realized the need for higher fiberized towers, and that's where it focuses on. And what not best time to replicate what was done in the tower industry in early 2000s and continuing up to 2008, 2009, when we developed the sharing model, which helped the Indian telco industry grow to another dimension. So tower organizations can play a similar role, obviously in the context of licensing requirements which exist. So this is a key parameter. We think that a FiberCo can be a natural progression for a tower company going forward. Then finally, digital India opportunities exist. All of you are aware about this, and there are various dimensions to this particular opportunity. Tower companies, depending upon their scale and size, can play different role in this particular segment. They can either be a complete aggregator, or they can play select roles as far as the infra is concerned. I think intra-city infrastructure will become more and more important, and as more and more data is consumed, this will become key as we go along. We have seen multiple examples and multiple business models which exist, in which how tower and telco operators, most of these are telco operator examples, how they have utilized smart city opportunities to offer certain services, whether it be fiber cable, CCTV camera, where you can provide surveillance as a service and charge something on a monthly basis. Fiber is a key asset which can be done, or offering some small cell solutions which can help capture the data requirement going forward. In the end, what I would like to say is that this is a very brief presentation of what we are seeing happening in the tower industry as part of the larger telco ecosystem we see. I think for the tower industry going forward, future is data. Data will drive future growth. What we will see is emergence of new business models, intra-city street level architectures and infrastructure deployments will become more and more critical, and we will see emergence of new solutions, new dimensions as we go along. These are very interesting times, and we see both opportunities as well as challenges for not only tower industry but the larger telco ecosystem as we go along. Now I will be open to any questions which you might have. Thank you. Thanks again for your time, and I will let the coordinator organize any questions which you might have. Thank you.
The first question is from Preeti. How data growth will translate into higher revenues for tower companies? What percentage of revenue growth can tower companies expect by 2020?
I think what I gave you was an instance of macro tenancy growth. I think data growth will have different aspects. The first component of the revenue growth will come from macro tenancy growth, which we can see from the CAGRs which we are reflecting here. In a base or a optimistic scenario, we are looking at something like 4.6 to 5.7% of tenancy growth. Obviously, it will depend upon, as we all know, telco margins are under pressure. There is a need for increased deployment. So we will have to see how telco and tower contracts are structured and how will the pricing move. So the first lever of growth will be your traditional macro tenancy growth. Second would be your addendums, which would be coming on these towers, and how you can leverage that going forward. Third could be new business models which we are looking at, whether it be smart city play, whether it be smart city play, or looking at fiber co or deploying other models as you go along. I think what we have done is we have estimated in detail how tower organizations or revenue will depend upon data growth going forward. And this is just an encapsulation, a brief on how we see this market and what impact will come. I hope I was able to answer your question in terms of giving what revenue categories exist and how will this pan out in the future.
Next question is from Sethu. How do we relate IoT growth with the data growth?
I think IoT growth is, and that's an interesting question. Thanks, Sethu, for asking this, and this is very relevant. So, say for example, the recent NASSCOM report of 2020, a NASSCOM report on IoT states that by 2020 we will have 2 billion IoT devices operating, and each of these IoT devices will be communicating to each other. And again, this data will need to be fed through our overall network architecture that we have. Either it is the enterprise-based architecture or it is a retail-based architecture that we are looking at. And this will result in huge accumulation of data, particularly sparse data, which we had never had access to. And this will in turn drive the data growth going forward. IoT and telcos have a key role to play there. M2M traffic and IoT traffic will become very critical in driving this data growth. Our expectation is that as much as 20% of this data traffic growth will start coming from because of IoT enabled initiatives by 2020. And if you see the launch of 5G, etc., post that, this proportion will only rise as we go along. So this is a key aspect and will play a key role in how data growth is driven in India going forward.
Next question is from Mukesh Kalra. Going forward, what will be the contribution of M2M communication towards data growth?
I think I answered this already. By 2020, we see almost 20 to 30% of the traffic coming from M2M IoT, which will increase as we go along over this particular period from that point onwards. I think the two questions were related, and that was answered in that.
Next question from Ajit Kumar. What would be impact of heavy operational losses reported by operators like Airtel and Idea on tower companies?
Yeah, that's a fairly interesting question, and it does not have a single answer in that sense. So I think what we have to realize is that tower depends upon its end customers, which in most cases tends to be operators. So as operators see more and more erosion of their bottom line, the pressure will definitely come on tower players as we go along, because tower players play a key part. Network capex accounts for almost 25% of overall capex, or network opex accounts for almost 25% of the overall opex of a telecom operator. Capex, telcos are actually spending something like 20 to 25% of their revenue on capex right now. Most of it is going into RAN, which is your radio access network, where towers play a key role. And as telcos look to increase their margins, as telcos look to increase their profitability, there will be increased pressure on tower organizations to look at their pricing models, come up with more innovative mechanisms of charging, and how should they go about it. I think this will happen, maybe not now, but maybe this will happen as we go along this particular path. However, the other link point is that how tower companies and operators are linked to each other, and how are the overall valuations will be driven as a result of this. So there are 2 or 3 interesting aspects of this, but in summary, increasing pressure on operators will definitely lead to increasing pressure on tower companies as we go along.
Next question is from Yogesh Arya. In most of European countries, data is very expensive and Wi-Fi is used more. Only in India, we have low rate for data and there is demand for macro sites. We may have to go for small cells going forward. Please give your comments.
And I completely agree with you. Let me just go to the slide which I had presented. If you look at this particular slide, this is specifically the point I am making, that even in India, given the physical constraints, given the spectrum requirements, given the cost of laying out infrastructure, and particularly in dense urban regions of a particular city, we think that Wi-Fi will become more and more dominant. Wi-Fi, along with other solutions, as you mentioned, like small cells, etc., will become more and more prevalent, and we will see more and more traffic being offloaded to that. So our estimate is that by 2022, almost 50% of the data traffic emerging in India will be handled by Wi-Fi and other mechanisms going forward. And all this will be aggregated into a macro site, which will then flow into your core network. So that's what our assumption is with regards to this. I think this will become more and more important given the various cost angles involved, user experience aspects involved, which is very critical because indoor data coverage is very critical for good data consumption going forward. So I completely agree with you, and you have a fair point to make.
The question is from Nitin. Thank you for your presentation. The current contract structure doesn't allow tower companies to gain significant advantage from data rollout. They will get only a fraction of revenue. Considering consolidation and merger, ARPU, do you really think tower companies will gain significant advantage from the data growth?
I think there are 2-3 aspects to it. A, we have to look at how telcos can spend. So operator consolidation in the short term will have an impact in terms of rationalization of sites. How do you go about it? How do you optimize your networks? But B, in the long term, operators will have higher ability to spend both on capex and opex to grow their network. And data network requirements will rise as we go along, and that will drive the growth in tenancies as we go along this particular market. Obviously, we will not see the growth rates what we were seeing between the period 2008 to 2012. However, we'll still continue to see reasonable growth in this particular aspect. Secondly, your point is valid, and which is the trend globally where addendums are not treated as full tenancies, and that continues to be the way. I think that will continue to be the way because that's how the contracts are structured in that point of time. However, what we are seeing is increasing need of fresh tenancies to cater for data growth, and that will continue to be the trend as well. Third, tower companies can look at this as an opportunity to transform their business model, look at newer plays, look at how network architectures are being restructured and how they can get maximum leverage out of it. So these are the 3 dimensions which we can look at as we go along in this path.
Next question is from Anup. Do you think that recent MVNO policy will have any impact on IoT or M2M initiatives of smaller organizations?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think, and we can discuss in detail, Anup, this is another aspect of it. I think IoT will play a key role, as I mentioned. MVNO policy in India needs to be seen. It's still being evaluated. Though some folks have shown focus, we have not seen any major rollouts happening in that particular sense. However, I think more and more players will look at IoT as a dimension to capture, particularly B2B IoT, and industrial IoT will become much more important in that aspect, and that's where we will see more and more growth happening. I think if we allow innovative entrepreneurs to come into play, where we see convergence of industries happening, we will see much more innovative solutions coming in that particular dimension, and how will we go about it. So I think it will have a positive impact, and what we will see is more and more innovative models coming into play as far as the market is concerned.
Next question is from Vijay. Hi Abhishek, everyone is looking forward to fiberization of towers. With the telco margins under pressure, who will invest on fiberization?
I think fiberization, and thanks Vijay for your question. and hi from my side as well. I think telco fiberization is given. Uh, if telcos in India will need to fiberize as we go along. Microwave-based architectures will not be able to sustain the data growth we will see. And in order to enable the user experience that we are looking at, we will see more and more fiberization of sites. Reliance Jio has shown by its example that how it focuses on fiberization and it's able to roll out that network. So I think fiberization is given. It will become it's already an imperative for operators in India and will become more and more prominent as we go along. I think telcos will look at innovative models, fiber swaps, maybe looking partnering on government municipal bodies with for smart city initiatives, or looking at a third party player who can roll out fiber networks for them and which can they be shared for them. So A, fiber is a necessity, and B, we will see shared economics model in fiber as well as we go along.
Question from Ansh. How Indian tower infra is different from elsewhere in terms of build, energy management reach, etc.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think Indian tower companies have been fairly innovative and have been fairly unique in their scale and size. Indus till more recently was the largest tower company in India with 120, 125,000 towers, and India has, say, for example, US has only 250 to 300,000 towers. India has almost 460 to 470,000 towers. So India has a huge expensive tower infrastructure. I think also the nature, our landscape is very different from, say, developed world, wherein we have different geographies, different terrains, energy. Most of our sites run on DG sets, which might not be the case as far as developed world is concerned. And security remains a key issue as we see in our tower players. So I think Indian tower players have done well. They have innovated reasonably. They have brought in automations wherever possible to help improve their operational cost, to have an operational rigor in place, and to roll out in that particular aspect. Obviously, there is a lot which can be done with regards to looking at IoT, maybe from a security angle or a power maintenance angle or from an energy analytics angle. There is a lot which can be done with regards to preventive maintenance. How do you go about it? And how do you integrate more technology into the overall tower operations as you go along? So this is how we see it. I think Indian tower industry has played a critical role in growth of Indian telecom sector, and there are various dimensions which they can inculcate from other players, but they have been certain, they have demonstrated certain examples which can be looked by others. Thank you.
Next question from Upender. Why are we not seeing adoption of alternative energy sources in tower management? Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's been slow. However, and radiation, and as you know, the regulation around EMF radiation key was a key factor as well, and there was a lot of debate around it. I think relatively it has been slow, but we would see more and more alternate solutions coming in. The cost of solar energy has come down over the last few years, and we would see more and more tower companies looking at these solutions going forward. So, so what you are seeing now has been relatively slow paced, but we will see increased focus as we go along, as the cost come down, as the economics become better, and as it becomes much more reliable to deploy these solutions. We will see more and more of these solutions being deployed.
This question comes from Rakesh. The cheap data rate charged by Jio is marketing strategy, or is it revenue business model which will help them to break even at this data rate?
I think this is I think this is something which we can discuss one-to-one, and I would not like to comment on this. I think this is an interesting question and open for debate, but uh, hope you understand that we cannot openly discuss such points on such forums. Thank you.
Okay. So taking our last question, The question is from Deepak. As happened in the case of telcos, do you envisage consolidation in Indian tower companies as well in terms of mergers and acquisitions, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and thanks for asking this. I think this is imperative. Indian landscape is driven by three big players and a couple of smaller players. Tower models by themselves are very profitable because they are primarily annuity based models, and if you reach a certain tenancy you can become profitable at that level. We think, and it's already happening in the industry, we think consolidation is given in tower industry as well, and within the next 2 to 3 years we would see smaller tower players either merge with someone or they will be acquired by someone. So tower consolidation is given. We will see it happening sooner than later, and this will happen as we go along. And the telco trend will replicate itself in tower trend as well. And it has already started happening, and there are talks in the market on how various tower players can be consolidated. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we won't be able to take all the questions due to time constraints. If you have any other questions, please send them at editor@ettelecom.com. I would like to thank Mr. Abhishek and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar.